The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training compound as Sarah Martinez laced up her combat boots for the first time. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her slight frame dwarfed by the towering male recruits around her. The drill sergeant's voice echoed across the yard, calling out names and assignments, but when he reached hers, his tone shifted to something that sounded almost like pity. Sarah had grown up in a small farming town in Kansas, where her father taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts with his old hunting rifle. She could hit a target at 200 yards before she could drive a car, but nobody here seemed to care about that. What they saw was a young woman who looked like she belonged in a college classroom, not on a battlefield. The whispers started immediately. Other recruits muttered about quotas and political correctness, questioning why the military was letting women into combat roles. Even some of the instructors seemed skeptical, their eyes lingering on her with doubt when they thought she wasn't looking. During the first week of basic training, Sarah overheard 2 sergeants discussing her file. "She'll never make it through sniper school," one said, shaking his head. "The physical demands alone will break her. And in a real firefight, she'll freeze up when bullets start flying." The other sergeant nodded in agreement. These desk generals making policy have never seen what happens when someone can't handle the pressure. "It gets people killed?" Sarah pretended not to hear, but their words burned in her chest. She had dreamed of serving her country since she was a little girl watching war movies with her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who had filled her head with stories of courage and sacrifice. He had always told her that heart mattered more than size, but now she wondered if he had been wrong. During weapons training, Sarah's natural shooting ability began to shine through. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at basic distances, she was grouping shots with precision that impressed even the most hardened instructors. But praise was scarce and skepticism remained thick in the air. When she volunteered for advanced marksmanship training, the rangemaster actually laughed. "Sweetheart," he said with a condescending smile, "shooting paper targets is one thing. Combat is entirely different. When someone's shooting back at you, when your buddies are bleeding out next to you, when the noise and chaos hit, that's when we see what people are really made of." The psychological evaluation was even worse. The military psychologist, a stern woman with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, spent an hour asking Sarah about her motivations, her fears, and her understanding of what combat really meant. At the end of the session, she looked up from her notes with a concerned expression. "Miss Martinez," she said carefully, "I want you to really think about this path you're choosing. Combat operations are unlike anything you can imagine. The stress, the violence, the split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. These aren't things that come naturally to most people, especially those without the physical advantages typically associated with warriors." Sarah left the evaluation feeling smaller than ever. That night, lying in her narrow bunk, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if everyone was right. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe she was just a farm girl with good aim, who had watched too many movies and listened to too many war stories. But then she remembered her grandfather's weathered hands, showing her how to steady a rifle, his patient voice explaining how to control her breathing, how to find that perfect moment between heartbeats when everything went still. He had served 3 tours in Vietnam, earning 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, and he had never treated her like she was fragile or incapable. "The best warriors aren't always the biggest or the strongest," he had told her once while they sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky orange and red. "They're the ones who can stay calm when everything around them is falling apart, who can think clearly when others panic, who never give up even when the odds are impossible." As weeks turned into months, Sarah pushed herself harder than anyone else. She ran farther, trained longer, and studied more intensively than her male counterparts. When others complained about the food or the early morning drills, she remained silent and focused. She knew she had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. The doubts didn't disappear, though. They followed her through every training exercise, every evaluation, every quiet moment when she questioned whether she was strong enough, tough enough, brave enough for what lay ahead. But somewhere deep inside, beyond the fear and uncertainty, a small flame of determination continued to burn. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was about to face challenges that would test not just her shooting skills or physical endurance, but her very soul. The real test wasn't going to come on a training range or in a classroom. It was going to come in the dust and heat of a foreign battlefield, where the stakes were life and death, and where she would have to prove not just to others, but to herself, that she belonged among warriors. 18 months later, Sarah found herself stepping off a transport plane into the scorching heat of Afghanistan. The air was thick with dust and the smell of jet fuel, and the mountains in the distance looked like jagged teeth against the pale sky. Forward Operating Base Hammer was a collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and guard towers surrounded by miles of hostile territory. Her unit, Bravo Company, was tasked with providing security for supply convoys traveling through one of the most dangerous regions in the country. The Taliban controlled much of the surrounding area, and improvised explosive devices were a constant threat along the roads. It was exactly the kind of assignment that would put Sarah's training to the ultimate test. The base commander, Colonel James Peterson, was a career soldier with 30 years of experience and scars that told stories of battles fought across multiple continents. When he reviewed the personnel files of incoming soldiers, Sarah's caught his attention immediately. Not because of her gender, but because of her exceptional marksmanship scores and the recommendations from her instructors. "Martinez," he said when she reported to his office, looking up from her file with curious eyes. "I've seen a lot of good shooters come through here, but your scores are impressive. How do you feel about putting those skills to real use?" Sarah straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Ready and willing, sir." The colonel studied her for a long moment. Despite her obvious competence, he had concerns. He had been in combat long enough to know that paper qualifications and real-world performance were often very different things. The enemy didn't care about training scores or how well someone could hit a target on a calm day at a firing range. "You'll be assigned to Sergeant Williams's squad," Peterson said finally. "They're our best convoy security team, but they've been taking heavy casualties lately. The Taliban have been getting more aggressive, more coordinated in their attacks. Sergeant Marcus Williams was a mountain of a man from Texas, with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could be heard over artillery fire. When Colonel Peterson told him about his new squad member, Williams's reaction was immediate and negative. "Sir, with all due respect, we can't afford any weak links out there," Williams said bluntly. "My boys are depending on each other to stay alive. This isn't a place for training exercises or social experiments." The other members of the squad were equally skeptical. There was Corporal Jake Thompson, a wiry kid from Detroit who had already survived 2 IED explosions. Private First Class Miguel Santos, whose steady hands made him their best driver. And Specialist David Chen, their medic, who had seen too much death and carried the weight of every life he couldn't save. They looked at Sarah with the same doubt she had faced during training. But here the stakes were infinitely higher. These men had been through hell together, had saved each other's lives multiple times, and had developed the kind of trust that only comes from shared danger. Now they were expected to accept an untested newcomer into their brotherhood. The first few weeks were brutal. Sarah struggled with the weight of her gear in the oppressive heat, fought constant dehydration, and dealt with equipment malfunctions that seemed to happen at the worst possible moments. During her first convoy mission, she threw up from motion sickness in the back of the armored vehicle, earning disgusted looks from her squad mates. "Maybe you should request a transfer to the kitchen," Thompson muttered as he handed her a bottle of water. Cooking might be more your speed, but Sarah refused to quit. Every morning she was up before dawn, checking and rechecking her equipment, studying maps of their patrol routes and practicing with her rifle. She memorized the names and faces of known enemy fighters, learned to identify the signs of roadside bombs, and pushed herself through physical training even when exhaustion made every muscle in her body ache. The breakthrough came during their 7th mission together. The convoy was traveling through a narrow valley when Santos spotted suspicious activity on a hillside about 800 meters away. Through her scope, Sarah could see armed figures moving between rocks and scrub brush, clearly positioning themselves for an ambush. "Contact right. Approximately 800 meters, she reported calmly into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Multiple targets, weapons visible. Williams grabbed his binoculars and scanned the hillside. "I see them. Martinez, can you get a clear shot?" Sarah adjusted her position, steadying her rifle against the vehicle's window frame. The wind was gusty, the distance was challenging, and she knew that missing would likely result in a full-scale ambush that could kill them all. Everything she had trained for, all the doubt and criticism she had endured, came down to this moment. She controlled her breathing, just as her grandfather had taught her all those years ago on the farm. The crosshairs settled on the lead figure, a man with an AK-47 who was clearly coordinating the ambush. Sarah found that perfect stillness between heartbeats and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the valley, and the enemy fighter dropped instantly. The other Taliban members scattered, their ambush broken before it could begin. The convoy continued safely to its destination, and for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, Sarah felt like she might actually belong there. That night, Williams pulled her aside as she cleaned her rifle. "That was good shooting today, Martinez," he said grudgingly. "Maybe you've got what it takes after all." It was the first real acknowledgement she had received from any of her squad mates, and it meant more to her than any medal or commendation ever could. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The real tests were still to come, and she would have to prove herself over and over again in a war where every day brought new dangers and new opportunities to fail. 3 months into her deployment, Sarah had settled into the rhythm of combat operations, but the real test of her abilities came on a sweltering Tuesday morning in July. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was planning to move through their sector, and Bravo Company was tasked with intercepting him. The mission required Sarah's squad to establish an overwatch position on a rocky ridge that provided clear sight lines over the suspected route. They moved out before dawn, carrying extra ammunition and water for what could be a long day of waiting and watching. The climb to their position was grueling in full gear, but Sarah kept pace with her squad mates without complaint. As the sun climbed higher, turning their rocky hiding spot into an oven, they settled in to wait. Sarah positioned herself behind her rifle, scanning the valley below through her scope while the others maintained watch in different directions. Hours passed with no movement except for occasional goat herders and their animals. Then, at approximately 1400 hours, movement caught Sarah's eye. A convoy of 3 vehicles was approaching from the east, moving much faster than normal civilian traffic. Through her scope, she could see armed men in the vehicles and recognized the distinctive profile of heavy weapons mounted in the truck beds. "Eyes on possible target convoy," she whispered into her radio, her voice barely audible even to her squad mates lying just a few feet away. 3 vehicles, multiple armed personnel approaching from grid 2847. Colonel Peterson's voice crackled through the radio from the command post back at base. Positive identification required before engagement. These could be Afghan National Army forces. Sarah adjusted her scope's magnification and studied the lead vehicle carefully. The driver was wearing a black turban that matched intelligence photos of their target, and she could see the distinctive scar on his left cheek that had been described in the briefing. But more importantly, she spotted the rocket-propelled grenade launcher mounted in the bed of the second truck, aimed directly at an Afghan police checkpoint just ahead on the road. "Confirmed target identification," she reported. "They're about to engage the police checkpoint. Request permission to fire." The seconds stretched like hours as Sarah watched the convoy approach the unsuspecting police officers. She could see children playing near the checkpoint and civilians walking along the road who would be caught in the crossfire if the attack proceeded. The Taliban fighters were now less than 200 meters from the checkpoint, close enough that she could see them preparing their weapons. "Permission granted," came Peterson's voice finally. "Engage at your discretion." Sarah's first shot took out the driver of the lead vehicle, causing it to veer off the road and crash into a ditch. The sudden stop threw several fighters from the truck bed, creating chaos in the convoy. Her second shot eliminated the RPG operator before he could fire on the checkpoint, and her third dropped the commander as he tried to rally his men. What followed was a fierce firefight that lasted nearly 2 hours. The surviving Taliban fighters took cover behind their vehicles and in roadside buildings, returning fire with automatic weapons and trying to maneuver closer to Sarah's position. But from her elevated vantage point, she could track their movements and pick them off one by one with precision shots. During the battle, Specialist Chen was wounded by a ricocheting bullet that caught him in the shoulder. Sarah immediately shifted her focus to providing cover fire, while Thompson dragged their medic to safety behind a large boulder. She methodically eliminated 3 fighters who were trying to flank their position, her shots coming so quickly and accurately that the enemy began to retreat. "How many is that?" Williams asked during a brief lull in the fighting, wiping sweat from his forehead as he reloaded his rifle. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was focused on a muzzle flash from a window about 400 meters away, where a sniper was trying to get a shot at their position. She waited patiently for him to expose himself again, then fired a single round that ended the threat permanently. 11 confirmed, she said quietly, ejecting her spent magazine and inserting a fresh one with practiced efficiency. The number hung in the air between them. In a single engagement, Sarah had eliminated more enemy fighters than some soldiers managed in entire deployments. Her squad mates looked at her with new eyes, no longer seeing the small farm girl who had struggled through her first weeks in country. When the firing finally stopped and the battlefield fell silent, Afghan police and army units moved in to secure the area. The high-value target was confirmed dead, along with most of his cell, preventing what intelligence later determined would have been a major attack on a nearby village. Back at the base that evening, Colonel Peterson called Sarah to his office. Word of the engagement had already reached higher command levels, and initial reports were being prepared for review by senior officers. The colonel looked at her with something that might have been respect as she stood at attention before his desk. "Martinez," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I've been doing this for 3 decades, and I've rarely seen marksmanship like what you displayed today. Your squad leader tells me you prevented what could have been a massacre at that checkpoint." Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond. She was still processing the events of the day, the weight of what she had done and the lives she had taken. The training had prepared her for the technical aspects of combat, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional reality of killing other human beings, even enemy fighters who would have gladly killed innocent civilians. "I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star," Peterson continued, "and I'm also putting in paperwork to get you advanced sniper training. We need more soldiers with your abilities." As Sarah walked back to her barracks that night, she passed groups of soldiers who had heard about the day's action. Some nodded respectfully. Others offered congratulations, but she could still see doubt in some eyes. One successful engagement didn't erase months of skepticism, and she knew she would have to prove herself again and again. But something had changed inside her during that firefight. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since arriving in Afghanistan had been replaced by a cold, professional confidence. She had looked death in the eye and not blinked. She had made split-second decisions under extreme pressure and saved lives. For the first time since putting on the uniform, Sarah truly felt like a soldier. The weeks following the convoy engagement brought a new dynamic to Sarah's relationship with her unit. While some soldiers had begun to respect her abilities, others seemed almost resentful of the attention her successful mission had generated. The military is a hierarchical institution, where reputation is earned slowly and jealously guarded, and Sarah's rapid rise from doubted newcomer to recognized marksman created tensions she hadn't anticipated. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a career infantry soldier with 15 years of service, was particularly vocal in his skepticism. He had arrived at Forward Operating Base Hammer 2 weeks after Sarah's successful engagement, and he made no effort to hide his opinion about women in combat roles. "One good day doesn't make someone a warrior," he told a group of soldiers during chow time, speaking loudly enough to ensure Sarah could hear him from across the mess hall. "Combat is about consistency, about performing when everything goes wrong, not about getting lucky once when conditions are perfect." Rodriguez had a point that even Sarah's supporters couldn't entirely dismiss. Combat effectiveness was indeed measured over time, through multiple engagements and varying conditions. A single successful mission, no matter how impressive, was just that, a single data point in what needed to be a pattern of reliable performance. The opportunity to prove that consistency came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces were planning a major offensive against several coalition bases in the region, including Forward Operating Base Hammer. The attack was expected to be the largest coordinated assault in months, potentially involving hundreds of fighters armed with mortars, rockets, and heavy weapons. Colonel Peterson made the decision to reinforce their perimeter defenses and establish advanced observation posts on the high ground surrounding the base. Sarah was assigned to Observation Post Delta, a rocky outcropping about 1,500 meters from the main base that provided excellent sight lines over the most likely avenue of approach for enemy forces. The team for OP Delta consisted of Sarah, Sergeant Williams, Corporal Thompson, and 2 other soldiers, Private Martinez, no relation to Sarah, despite the shared surname, and Specialist Johnson. They would be essentially isolated during the attack, responsible for providing early warning and eliminating high-value targets while the main force defended the base itself. The assault began at 347 hours with a barrage of mortar, fire that lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks. Sarah was instantly awake at the first incoming round, her training taking over as she moved to her predetermined firing position. Through her night vision scope, she could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions across the valley as Taliban fighters began their advance. Multiple contacts, bearing 280 degrees, approximately 1,200 meters, she reported calmly, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The base's defensive systems were responding with heavy machine gun fire and their own mortars, creating a cacophony of explosions and gunfire that made communication difficult. What made this engagement different from her previous success was the sheer scale and complexity of the battle. Instead of a small convoy with a dozen fighters, Sarah was now facing what appeared to be a full company-sized element with coordinated fire support. Enemy snipers were actively hunting for her muzzle flash, forcing her to change positions frequently and limiting her ability to take careful, aimed shots. The first kill came at a range of nearly 800 meters, a Taliban fighter operating a heavy machine gun that was pinning down a patrol trying to reinforce the perimeter. Sarah's shot silenced the weapon and allowed the patrol to advance, but she had to immediately relocate as enemy mortar rounds began landing near her previous position. As the battle intensified, Sarah found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse with multiple enemy marksmen. Every shot she fired revealed her position, requiring her to move quickly to avoid return fire. The rocky terrain provided good concealment but made movement difficult, especially while carrying her heavy rifle and additional ammunition. "Martinez, we've got a problem," Williams called out over the radio. "There's a recoilless rifle team setting up on the ridge to our north. If they get that thing operational, they can punch holes right through the base's defenses." Sarah swiveled her rifle toward the indicated position and began scanning through her scope. The recoilless rifle was a serious threat, capable of destroying vehicles and fortified positions with a single well-placed round. Finding the crew in the darkness and broken terrain was like looking for needles in a haystack, but she eventually spotted them setting up their weapon behind a cluster of boulders. The range was over 900 meters, and the wind had picked up significantly since the battle began. Sarah had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the fact that her targets were partially concealed behind cover. She took her time, controlling her breathing and waiting for the perfect moment when the gunner exposed himself to align his weapon. The shot was perfect, dropping the gunner instantly and forcing the rest of the crew to abandon their position. But Sarah's success was short-lived. Enemy forces had triangulated her position based on her muzzle flash, and mortar rounds began falling uncomfortably close to her hiding spot. For the next 3 hours, Sarah engaged target after target while constantly moving to avoid counterfire. She eliminated 2 more machine gun teams, several enemy leaders trying to coordinate attacks, and a sniper who had been effectively harassing the base's defenders. Each successful shot required her to immediately displace to a new position, carrying her heavy rifle and gear across difficult terrain in complete darkness. By dawn, the Taliban assault had been repelled, but at a significant cost. The base had suffered several casualties, and 2 of the observation posts had been overrun during the fighting. OP Delta had held its position throughout the night, largely due to Sarah's ability to eliminate key enemy targets and disrupt their coordinated attacks. When the sun finally rose over the battlefield, Sarah found herself exhausted but unharmed. Her uniform was torn from crawling across rocks. Her hands were cut and bleeding from handling her rifle without gloves, and her voice was hoarse from hours of radio communications. But she was alive, and more importantly, so were her squad mates. The final count of confirmed kills from the night's engagement was 17 enemy fighters, all eliminated by Sarah from ranges between 400 and nearly 1,000 meters, under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. It was a performance that silenced even her harshest critics and established her reputation as one of the most effective snipers in the theater of operations. But with that reputation came new pressures and expectations that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Success in combat was a double-edged sword. It brought respect and recognition, but it also painted a target on her back and raised the stakes for every future engagement. Word of Sarah's performance during the base assault traveled quickly through military channels, reaching not just higher command levels, but also enemy intelligence networks. The Taliban had been tracking coalition sniper activity for months, and the sudden appearance of an exceptionally accurate marksman in their area of operations had not gone unnoticed. Within 2 weeks of the battle, intercepted communications revealed that the Taliban had placed a bounty on the ghost sniper who had been disrupting their operations. They didn't know Sarah's name or gender, but they had accurate descriptions of her equipment and tactics, and they were actively hunting for her during every mission. Colonel Peterson called Sarah into his office to brief her on this development. The intelligence report spread across his desk painted a troubling picture of an enemy that was adapting specifically to counter her effectiveness. "Martinez," the colonel said, his expression serious, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You've become a high-value target. The enemy is changing their tactics specifically because of you, which means they're going to be looking for you on every operation." Sarah absorbed this information calmly, though inside she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the colonel's office. Being targeted by the enemy was both a mark of respect and a death sentence if she made any mistakes. "Sir, does this change my mission assignments?" she asked. Peterson shook his head. "If anything, it makes you more valuable to our operations. But it also means we need to be smarter about how we deploy you. No more routine patrols or standard convoy security. From now on, you're reserved for high-priority missions where your skills can make the biggest difference." The first of these special assignments came just 3 days later. A convoy carrying medical supplies to a remote village had been ambushed, and several soldiers were trapped in a compound surrounded by enemy fighters. Standard rescue operations had failed because Taliban snipers were covering all approaches to the building, making it impossible for ground forces to advance. Sarah's mission was to eliminate the enemy snipers and provide overwatch for a rescue team. The complexity of the operation was unlike anything she had faced before. Multiple hidden targets in an urban environment, with friendly forces in the line of fire and civilian buildings providing countless hiding spots for enemies. The insertion itself was dangerous. Sarah and a small support team had to be dropped by helicopter onto a rooftop, nearly a kilometer from the target area, then make their way through hostile territory to reach a position where she could engage the enemy snipers. Every step of the journey carried the risk of ambush or discovery. Once in position, Sarah began the painstaking process of locating her targets. Enemy snipers were professionals, well concealed and disciplined enough to avoid revealing their positions unnecessarily. She had to wait for muzzle flashes, movement, or the glint of sunlight off scope lenses, any tiny mistake that would give away their locations. The first sniper she identified was positioned in a minaret about 600 meters away, using the religious building's height advantage to control a key intersection. Sarah had to calculate not just range and wind, but also the angle of elevation and the possibility that her bullet might pass through multiple walls before reaching its target. Her shot shattered the minaret's window and eliminated the sniper, but it also revealed her position to the remaining enemy fighters. Almost immediately, bullets began snapping past her head as other Taliban marksmen tried to locate and eliminate her. Sarah had to move constantly, using the urban environment's cover and concealment while continuing to hunt for targets. The psychological pressure was immense. She knew that trapped soldiers were depending on her success, that any mistake could result in their deaths. At the same time, she was being actively hunted by skilled enemy snipers who knew the terrain better than she did and had the advantage of prepared positions. Over the next hour, Sarah eliminated 4 more enemy snipers in a deadly game of hide-and-seek, played across rooftops and through building windows. Each shot required her to expose herself to return fire, and twice she had to abandon her position when enemy marksmen came close to hitting her. The final sniper proved to be the most challenging. He was positioned inside a school building, using children's desks for cover and firing through a classroom window. Sarah couldn't use explosive rounds or high-powered ammunition because of the risk to the building's structure, and the target was only partially visible behind improvised cover. She waited for nearly 20 minutes, watching through her scope for any movement or opportunity. Finally, the enemy sniper made the mistake of adjusting his position, exposing just enough of his head and shoulder for Sarah to take the shot. The bullet traveled over 700 meters and struck with surgical precision, ending the threat. With the enemy snipers eliminated, the rescue team was able to advance and extract the trapped soldiers. All personnel were recovered alive, though several had sustained injuries during the prolonged siege. The mission was declared a complete success, but Sarah felt the weight of what she had accomplished. She had killed 5 men in less than 2 hours, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately taken. These weren't random fighters caught in the chaos of battle, but skilled professionals who had been trying just as hard to kill her. The personal nature of sniper duels created a different psychological burden than the more impersonal violence of large-scale combat. That night, as she cleaned her rifle and prepared her equipment for the next mission, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The uncertain farm girl who had struggled through basic training was gone, replaced by a professional warrior who could make life and death decisions under extreme pressure. But with that transformation had come costs she was only beginning to understand. She slept fitfully, when she slept at all, and found herself constantly scanning for threats even when she was supposed to be resting. The hypervigilance that kept her alive in combat was becoming a permanent state of mind. More missions followed in rapid succession. Sarah found herself deployed on increasingly complex and dangerous operations, her reputation growing with each successful engagement. She eliminated enemy leaders, disrupted weapons shipments, and provided precision fire support for special operations teams conducting raids against high-value targets. The kill count continued to climb. 28 confirmed, then 35, then 42. Each number represented a human life ended by her rifle, a decision made in a split second that would last forever. Sarah didn't keep track of the numbers herself, but others did, and the statistics followed her like shadows. By the time her deployment reached the 8-month mark, Sarah had become something of a legend within military circles. Stories of her engagements were told and retold, often growing more dramatic with each telling. But she remained focused on the mission, on the soldiers whose lives depended on her accuracy, and on getting through each day in one piece. The moment that would define Sarah Martinez's entire military career came on a gray October morning, 10 months into her deployment. She was scheduled to rotate home in just 6 weeks, but the war had one final test waiting for her. Intelligence had located a Taliban training camp where suicide bombers were being prepared for attacks against coalition forces and Afghan civilians. The camp was hidden in a remote valley, heavily defended and surrounded by terrain that made conventional assault nearly impossible. The mission required a small team to infiltrate the area and eliminate key targets while Afghan special forces conducted the main assault on the compound. Sarah was assigned as the primary sniper for the operation, tasked with neutralizing sentries and providing overwatch. For the assault team, what should have been a routine special operations mission turned into a nightmare when the team's helicopter was hit by enemy fire during insertion. The aircraft crashed in the valley, 3 kilometers from their intended landing zone and deep in hostile territory. 2 soldiers were killed in the crash and 3 others were seriously injured, leaving Sarah and 5 other soldiers to complete the mission while protecting their wounded comrades. The situation was desperate. They were outnumbered, surrounded by enemy forces, and cut off from immediate support. Their radio equipment had been damaged in the crash, limiting their ability to call for help, and enemy fighters were already moving to surround their position. Sarah found herself in command of the survivors, not because of rank but because she was the only one who remained fully combat effective. The first priority was establishing a defensible position. Sarah led the group to a rocky ridge that provided good fields of fire and some protection from enemy assault. While the others set up a perimeter and tended to the wounded, she began engaging Taliban fighters who were trying to close the distance to their position. For the next 14 hours, Sarah fought what amounted to a private war against overwhelming odds. Enemy forces launched wave after wave of attacks against their position, forcing her to constantly shift between different firing positions to avoid being overrun. She had to ration her ammunition carefully while making every shot count, knowing that running out of bullets would mean death for everyone in her care. The psychological pressure was unlike anything she had experienced before. Not only was she fighting for her own life, but the lives of her wounded comrades depended entirely on her ability to keep enemy forces at bay. Every missed shot, every moment of hesitation, could result in the death of soldiers who were counting on her protection. As daylight faded and the temperature dropped, Sarah's ammunition began to run dangerously low. She had started the mission with 200 rounds of rifle ammunition, but hours of continuous combat had reduced her supply to fewer than 30 bullets. Each shot now had to be perfect, eliminating not just any enemy fighter but the most dangerous threats to their survival. The final assault came just before dawn, when Taliban forces attempted to overrun their position under cover of darkness. Sarah could hear them moving through the rocks below, coordinating their attack in whispered voices that carried on the cold mountain air. She had only 12 rounds remaining, and there were at least 20 enemy fighters approaching their position. In those desperate minutes, Sarah reached a level of combat effectiveness that few soldiers ever achieve. Using her night vision scope and an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield, she began eliminating enemy fighters with shots that seemed impossible even to trained observers. Moving targets at extreme range in near total darkness, each one dropped with a single bullet that found its mark with mechanical precision. When the sun finally rose and rescue helicopters arrived, they found Sarah still at her position, rifle ready, watching for threats that no longer existed. The battlefield around their small perimeter was littered with enemy casualties, a testament to 14 hours of precise, deadly marksmanship under conditions that would have broken most soldiers. The final count from that engagement was 37 confirmed enemy kills, bringing Sarah's total to 79 for her deployment. But more importantly, all 5 of her wounded comrades survived the night and were successfully evacuated. Her actions had prevented what could have been a complete disaster from becoming a tragedy that ended multiple military careers and destroyed several families. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in the base conference room, still processing the events of that October morning. Colonel Peterson had called a meeting of all senior staff and unit commanders, ostensibly for a routine briefing, but Sarah suspected something unusual was happening when she was specifically ordered to attend. The room was packed with officers, senior enlisted personnel, and several individuals she didn't recognize who appeared to be visiting from higher command levels. Sarah took a seat near the back, uncomfortable with the attention she was receiving from the assembled leadership. Colonel Peterson stood at the front of the room, holding a folder that Sarah recognized as a personnel file. When he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of someone about to make an important announcement that had been carefully considered and thoroughly documented. "Ladies and gentlemen," Peterson began, "we're here today to discuss the combat performance of one of our soldiers. There have been questions raised about the effectiveness of certain personnel in combat roles, specifically regarding their ability to perform under extreme pressure and in direct contact with enemy forces." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Despite her successful missions and growing reputation, she wondered if this was finally the moment when her critics would have their way. Perhaps someone had decided that her gender still disqualified her from combat operations, regardless of her proven abilities. "Some of you have expressed doubts," Peterson continued, looking directly at Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and several other soldiers who had been vocal in their skepticism about women in combat. "You've suggested that certain individuals might not have what it takes when the situation becomes truly desperate." The colonel opened the personnel file and began reading from what appeared to be an official report. During her 10-month deployment to Forward Operating Base Hammer, Sergeant Sarah Martinez has participated in 43 combat missions. She has been directly responsible for eliminating 79 confirmed enemy combatants, including 12 high-value targets specifically identified by intelligence services. A murmur went through the room as the officers processed these numbers. 79 confirmed kills was an exceptional tally for any soldier, regardless of their role or length of deployment. For a first deployment soldier, who had faced constant skepticism about her capabilities, the numbers were extraordinary. Her actions have directly resulted in the successful completion of numerous high-priority missions, the protection of civilian populations, and the preservation of coalition and Afghan military personnel. Peterson continued. During the October 15th incident, Sergeant Martinez single-handedly held off a force of approximately 60 enemy fighters for 14 hours while protecting 5 wounded comrades, eliminating 37 threats and ensuring the survival of her entire team. The room had fallen completely silent. Even Sarah's harshest critics were staring at her with expressions that ranged from surprise to grudging respect. The numbers spoke for themselves in a way that no amount of argument or prejudice could refute. Colonel Peterson closed the file and looked directly at Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Sergeant Rodriguez, you stated that combat effectiveness requires consistency and the ability to perform when everything goes wrong. You suggested that one good engagement didn't qualify someone as a warrior. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly understanding where this conversation was heading. Yes, sir, that's correct. Well, Sergeant, Peterson said with a slight smile, I think we can all agree that 79 confirmed enemy kills across 43 separate engagements demonstrates the kind of consistency you were looking for. And I believe that surviving 14 hours of combat while outnumbered 12-1 qualifies as performing when everything goes wrong. The colonel's words hung in, the air like a challenge that no one could reasonably dispute. Sarah had not just proven herself capable of combat operations. She had exceeded the performance of most veteran soldiers and established herself as one of the most effective fighters in the theater of operations. Sergeant Martinez will be returning to the United States next month, Peterson announced, where she will be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during the October 15th engagement. She has also been recommended for advanced sniper training and will likely be assigned to special operations units upon completion of her current service obligation. As the meeting concluded, and officers began filing out of the room, several approached Sarah to offer congratulations or simply to shake her hand. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was among them, his expression showing genuine respect rather than the skepticism that had characterized their previous interactions. Martinez, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you and I'm man enough to admit it. Sarah accepted his handshake and his apology, with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire deployment. She had never sought vindication or recognition, only the opportunity to serve her country and prove that she belonged among warriors. That evening, as Sarah packed her equipment for the journey home, she reflected on the transformation she had undergone during her 10 months in Afghanistan. The uncertain farm girl who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Hammer had been forged into a battle-tested warrior through trial by fire. She had faced every challenge, overcome every obstacle, and silenced every critic through the only currency that mattered in combat: results. The numbers that Colonel Peterson had read to the room would follow Sarah for the rest of her military career, but they were more than statistics. Each confirmed kill represented a moment when she had made the right decision under extreme pressure, when her training and instincts had combined to protect innocent lives and accomplish the mission. They were proof that courage and skill transcended physical size or gender, and that the best warriors were indeed those who could remain calm when everything around them was falling apart.